Burma. 1944, the war drags on and one man breaks. Private Herman Perry, a black soldier, is brutalized by racism and the jungle alike. And he pulls the trigger on a white lieutenant and vanishes. What follows is one of the wildest manhunt of the World War II. Perry disappears in the Pacte mountain, evading tigers and soldiers until he's taken by the Naga, a headhunting tribe who calls him the Jungle Kings. Soon, on Back in America, I will interview journalist and author Brendan Koerner, whose book, Now the Hell Will Start, uncovers this haunting, true story of rebellion, freedom, and the cost of survival. So stay tuned.